Hello everybody, thank you so much for joining me again today. We will be going through Job chapters 1 through 15 because the original Bible study was for Job chapters 1 through 31, but that, there we go, will take a long time to get through. So again, I'm going to be splitting this up into two videos. Job chapters 1 through 15 and chapters 16 through 31. By that time I should be done with the next Bible study, which will again be two videos because that's about 30 chapters as well. So without further ado, let's get right into it. Job chapter 1. Let's notice the kind of man Job is. He's a man who has loved and feared God and has been blessed for it. He's considered perfect and upright, fearing God and eschewing evil. He's gone so far as to offer offerings for his children when they feasted in each other's houses in case they sinned against God in their hearts. He was probably the best example of God blessing those who trust and obey him, and the last person we'd expect to suffer for any reason. Here we see that there are some days when the sons of God, angels, present themselves to the Lord, and Satan is among them. God asks where he's been, and Satan basically tells God he's been traveling the world. Why? We get a little hint at this when God brings up Job, his servant, who is a perfect example of a person who fears him and eschews evil. Satan was looking for someone to accuse, which is one of the meanings of his names, the accuser. Satan then counters that Job only fears God and eschews evil because Job is blessed and protected from all evil. To prove his point, God allows Satan to touch whatever Job has, but not Job himself. Notice that Satan's argument seems on its face to make sense. Evil will seem to make sense, but it's always about looking for a weakness in something good, even when there is no such weakness. It's about casting doubt, fear, weakness, tearing down what has been built. Good is about tearing down what has been changed by evil to rebuild something better, while evil is about tearing down what's good to leave ruins in its wake. Satan's role is the accuser, and he's looking for any excuse to accuse God's best. We know we're on God's good side when Satan attacks us. Notice that God gives Satan the power to do whatever he wanted to everything that was Job's, but not to Job himself. This was all to prove a point. Satan wanted God to turn on Job because he was a righteous man, and God was giving Job's righteousness as a good example of why he shouldn't. Satan is given power to influence people, to call down fire from heaven and to send a destructive wind. God already knows the outcome. He already knows what he plans to do for Job after Satan has pushed him as far as he can. Job provides what may be the best answer to evil outcomes in our lives. Sure, he responds to all of the horrible, terrible news by showing his grief, by tearing his mantle and shaving his head, but then he falls down on the ground and worships. Why? Because he has a good view of life, and it's one that can give us strength when we're downtrodden. Naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return thither. The Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all this Job did not sin, nor charge God foolishly like so many of us might. This doesn't mean that we should force this way of thinking on those who are grieving. They need to be able to let their grief out. However, it does mean that when we are grieving, we should remember how Job dealt with his grief and work it in our lives as best as we can. Hard times come upon us all, and the right way of thinking can make a difference between coming out of it held up high and coming out of it just barely, if at all. Job chapter 2. Notice that this chapter starts out with a replay of the events from the first chapter. This time God adds that though Satan moved God against Job to destroy him without cause, which is what Satan was trying to do, Job still held on to his integrity. Satan brings up what by itself is a good point. In general, we would all give up anything to save our lives. Our survival instincts are strong with us. When we seem to have lost everything, we also tend to throw in the towel all too early. We should do our best to make Satan wrong on that account. Not to get ourselves killed, but to withstand all adversity and hold fast to what we have received, to give us strength to stand when the devil attacks us, and having done all, to be still standing. Satan's claims that Job, like so many of us in the face of adversity, will curse God to his face should God touch his bone and flesh, which means to disease him. That's when God allows Satan to do anything short of taking Job's life. Killing Job for no good reason would give Satan too much power. We also see that God has plans for Job, for after Job has gone through this time of trouble and trial, and God doesn't want Job to die. This time Satan smites Job with boils from head to toe, and Job sits down among the ashes and scrapes himself with a piece of a clay pot to seek relief. It's in our nature to seek relief from suffering whenever we can find it, wherever we can find it, but we can temper that by holding on to our faith in the face of adversity, no matter what it is, because it's that very faith that will carry us through the hard times. Though it seems to be forever, tough times always come to an end somehow. Notice that Job's wife was so disgusted by him, so put off by him, and had so much pity for him that she is moved to tempt Job to curse God and die. This would be a permanent solution to a temporary problem. How many of us have felt such suffering that we sometimes entertain the thought of death? That's what Satan wants for us, because tough times come to an end, and God has something good planned for us all after them. This is why we should do our best to stick it out and encourage others to do the same, though it won't do them any good initially to hear this. When they get to the point in their journey that will allow them to think things through, then we can offer them this truth. Notice also that Job has a good answer to his wife. Shall we receive good from God and not receive evil? We should receive everything that we receive from God and not rail against him for it. Now at first Job's friends do quite a good job of trying to comfort him in his time of affliction. They mourn with him as he mourns, they sit quietly with him for 7 days and nights, and they don't try to talk him out of his grief. At first, they are good friends and comforters. We'll soon see if they keep on that path or diverge from it. You'll have to excuse me for that. I forgot to take my medicine. Job chapter 3. Notice how Job speaks about the day he was born. Job is entering into great grief. His crops are gone, his livestock is gone, and his servants and his family have been killed, and his wife thinks it would be good for him to curse God and die, not to mention the plague of boils. He spent his entire life doing right and fearing God and eschewing evil, and all of a sudden, knowing nothing but what's happened in the earthly plane, he suffers all of these things. No wonder he wishes they had died in the womb or been born too early. It's understandable that grieving people would wish that they were never born. We do tend to remember the best about the past and forget the worst, but that's only in certain frames of mind. When we're in a bad frame of mind, we remember the worst and forget the best. Job is in the worst place he could ever be in his entire life. He's wishing that he would have died or not even been born. It's good to let people voice their grief and not try to browbeat them with rebuke for it. Rather, we should let them be able to voice their grief and make it known that we want to help however we can, even if that means sitting silently with them. The time for righteous doctrine is further down the line as the grief is subsiding. The time for understanding and support is immediately. It's interesting to note that these were all the things that Job feared would come upon him. He asks why men who are in misery are given light and not death. He wonders why those who are in misery do not get the death they seek. He talks about how he was not in safety, had no rest, nor was in quiet, but trouble came. Though this might seem like an obvious thing, that his not being in safety, rest, and quiet would eventually lead to trouble, we have to remember that he trusted in God and obeyed him. He wished for death in this time of great suffering when everything that he feared would come upon him. This is more grief talking, and we should remember to do everything that we can short of making the problem worse, to convince people who seem ready to take their own lives to not do that. Troubles and trials are temporary, and death is a permanent solution to a temporary problem. Nonetheless, we should let them grieve however they will, and only when they're grieving will let them accept sound doctrine should we give it to them. Job chapter 4. Notice what Eliphaz the Temanite is saying. He's speaking what's essentially true, but it's not right to speak at this time. They hear Job out, and then they counter with this. First, they're upset with Job that he whose words have helped those who were falling and weak is now suffering himself, and he's showing so much weakness in his words of suffering. Then they try to imply that he's done something to deserve this trouble. He tells Job that this is his fear, confidence, hope, and the uprightness of his ways at work. He claims that those who sin are the ones who suffer and die, and not those who are innocent or righteous, so Job must be suffering for his sins. He brings up the lions and how they are silenced, wounded, perished, and have their families scattered by God himself, as if this is all from God. He blames God for what happens to Job and blames Job for deserving it, and moreover he browbeats Job for having the strength to help those who have suffered and not having that strength for himself in his suffering. This is exactly the wrong way to handle this. Where's the love? Where's the compassion? Where's the charity? Eliphaz then claims that he had a terrifying dream and his spirit came to tell him something. This doesn't seem to have been an angel, but it appears to have been the spirit of a man, or perhaps another spirit masquerading as a man. The spirit then, so it would appear, gives Eliphaz his answer to Job. I believe that it was either Satan or one of his spirits. The premise is true, but it's given against another untrue premise, which is how the conclusion is untrue. Evil usually includes some truth in what it says, but then it mixes it with some untruth or with a lack of love to produce its message. The message is that no man is just before God, and that everyone is judged by God, and that man is destroyed by the judgment of the righteous God in our weakness of body, and we die without wisdom. This is true, but it's being used against Job, who did nothing to deserve this suffering, which is not in and of itself from God. Most of all, there is no love to this message. It's all judgment talking, and this judgment is wrong. We will see how Job responds to it soon. Job chapter 5. Eliphaz continues in this chapter talking about how wrath kills the foolish man and envy slays the silly one. He curses the habitation of the foolish who takes root. He talks about how their children are far from safety and crushed at the gate with none to deliver them. He talks about the harvest being eaten up and taken even out of the thorns, and the robbers swallowing up their substance. This both hits hard at his belief that the only wicked and sinful people suffer, which is demonstrably wrong, but it also hits hard at Job's situation. Remember how his crops were destroyed with fire from heaven, and his children were killed by the destruction of a wind? He knew what had happened to Job, which may be why he talked this way. This is the wrong way to treat anyone who's suffering. We don't know why they're suffering, and even if we do, it's as long as it's not the result of sin, and sometimes even when it is, we should speak love to them and hold on to truth until they can bear to hear it. He goes on to tell Job to go to God and bring his cause before God, is almost as if he was saying, if I were you. What we see is a man who preaches to a suffering man, and that's not what you do to someone who's suffering. They may need to hear some words from God, but they can't bear it immediately. He also gives off this holier-than-thou vibe, as if he was so much better than Job by bringing up all this praise to God, by talking about how God reaches out for those who are low and poor and humble to lift them up, and leaves the high and mighty and sinful low. He acts like he's better than Job, which is another thing you shouldn't do when you're dealing with someone who's grieving or going through a crisis or some trauma. None of us are better than anyone else, and we have no right to act like it. Then he acts like he's trying to say these things for Job's good, like what Job is going through will correct him and set his paths right, and he will be rewarded afterward. While we see that Job will be rewarded for sticking it out through all of this, we can also see right now that this is especially a slap in the face from someone who just acted like he was holier than thou and accused him of committing some kind of sin worthy of these things. Telling someone that they're going through what they're enduring because they sinned somehow, especially when we don't know that for sure, is bad enough. Acting like you're better than them is even worse, especially when you use religion to build that ivory tower. Telling someone to hold on through their troubles and trials because they'll be set right and receive good things afterward is just next level bad. When we don't know for sure why someone is suffering, we should not tell them it's because of some failure on their part. When we come to comfort them, even if it is because of something they've done, we should never act like we're better than they are, and we shouldn't browbeat them with religion. When we're trying to come up with something to comfort them, we shouldn't tell them to basically suck it up and it's always darkest before the dawn or any other such platitudes. We'll see Job's reaction in this next chapter. Job chapter 6. Job starts this off not by attacking his friends because his focus is on his suffering and how it seems to have come from God himself. After all, only God truly has all power. It doesn't even occur to him in his time of suffering that it might be Satan, perhaps because he doesn't know about Satan, but more likely because God has been so favorable to him in the past, and now God was allowing such horrible things to happen to him. He wishes that God would kill him, because he has no strength in himself to save himself in the state he's in. Notice that there is one line that might be against Eliphaz's speech at the very beginning. He wishes that his grief would be thoroughly weighed and his calamity laid in the balances together. He feels like everything good has been taken out of his life, and only that which is evil comes upon him now, and he can't see a future without this suffering. This is so much like how we all tend to see things in our suffering, which makes it hard to press onward through the pain. Then he finally does accuse his friends of being hurtful to him. He compares them to streams that are black ice and evaporate when the heat comes. He points out that they see how he's cast down and are afraid. He accuses them of digging a pit for him, and even so he pleads with them to teach him and cause him to understand where he has erred. He was innocent and didn't deserve what was happening to him, but his friends were arguing that he did, because he believed that nobody gets what they don't deserve under any circumstances, so he's giving him a chance to explain what he did wrong to deserve his suffering. He then insists on his own innocence. Job is reacting like a good friend would react if we treated him or her like Eliphaz treated Job in his suffering. In his suffering, though Job's point of view is from suffering and would almost seek a permanent solution to a temporary problem, Job still has a good point against Eliphaz, which is why we should not use the Eliphaz approach. Job chapter 7. Here Job says exactly what he's thinking and feeling. He feels like there will never be any end to his suffering except for death. He seeks death because he seeks relief. He wants to speak because he needs an outlet for his grief and suffering. He feels like he can't bear this anymore. When he goes to bed, he waits for it to be morning so the night can be gone. He's a suffering man, grieving over his losses and pain. He now speaks to God, saying that not even his sleep is a comfort or respite to him because he has terrible nightmares. He wants nothing more than to be left alone and wait for death to come. He says himself that his days are vanity, and when we go into Ecclesiastes, we see a similar sentiment from someone who wasn't suffering nearly as badly as Job was suffering. He then asks what man is that God should magnify him and set his heart on man, something that we see in the Psalms as well. He asks when God will depart from him. He then admits that he has sinned because there is no one who has not sinned except for Jesus Christ. He then asks why God sets him as a mark against him so that he is a burden to himself. He asks why God won't pardon him and take away his sin. He wants to sleep in the dust or die and not be found in the morning. Clearly his suffering is so bad that he sees no way out, no future without it, nothing good in his past and nothing but anger from the Lord as he sees it. This is truly a sympathetic man worthy of our sympathy. How many people do we know who feel this way? How can we reach out to them and help them bear their burdens until they can let them down and leave them behind? Job chapter 8. Now we see Bildad the Shuhite speak. What does he speak? A complete misunderstanding of God and his justice. He brings up this prosperity gospel of sorts. If you did what was right, even if you would seek God and make supplication to him for your sins or the sins of your children, God would restore you and make you to prosper. This is the same problem people have when they appeal to the so-called problem of evil, which is the claim that evil shouldn't possibly exist if there is a God. However, the fact that evil exists, that evil is a derivation from good, a deviation from good, and that there is a standard for good and evil all leads us back to the same conclusion. There must be a God who set that standard, who creates good, and who calls evil what it is. Furthermore, there is so much left neglected in the problem of evil that it's less a problem for believers and more a problem for the one who appeals to it. In short, evil doesn't always come upon us because of our sins. And sometimes bad things do happen to good people, as it happened to Job. Of course, we know this because we see what's going on behind the scenes early on, but his friends should have known better than to blame a man for sins they couldn't know, whether or not he had committed, and they shouldn't have blasphemed God by judging that he was the one doing these things personally, or that he was doing this because Job was a sinner. Here Bildad doubles down and claims that it's only the sinner who suffers. He claims that is what's been observed since ancient times, and Job need only inquire of those who came before them on the matter. He doesn't acknowledge that Job either has not sinned or doesn't know what his sin might be. He doesn't acknowledge that there may be other reasons for suffering. He doesn't acknowledge that the wicked sometimes do prosper in their wickedness and the innocent sometimes do suffer in their innocence. Worst of all, rather than lightening Job's load, he heaps more upon it by accusing Job of some sort of sin deserving this suffering. Some friend this guy is. Then he ends with what he must have thought was a good, encouraging ending. He tries to tell Job that God will not cast away a perfect man, of which there are truly none, nor will he help evildoers until he fills Job's mouth with laughing and his lips with rejoicing. He ends by saying, "They that hate thee shall be clothed with shame, and the dwelling place of the wicked shall come to naught." It's almost like he's trying to encourage Job to repent of his sin and do supplication to God for it, and then just wait for the blessings to flow in. This is exactly what the prosperity gospel is about. If you're suffering at all, it's because you've sinned or you don't have enough faith. If you're prospering, it's because you've been righteous or you had lots of faith. It's a false dichotomy, and not only causes more needless suffering in the justification of sin, and it only causes more needless suffering in the justification of sin as if it was something good. Job chapter 9. Notice what Job does here. He answers that he knows that what Bildad just said is true. He's just saying that he can't stand before God. God is almighty and all-knowing. He brings up a few scientific truths here, like that the sky and the universe are spread out, and he speaks of some constellations that are known in our language as Arcturus, Orion, and Pleiades, but are known by other names in the Hebrew. He says that God is too great for him, and he dare not say that he's perfect, because if he boasts of himself, he will be found a sinner. He can't answer God and prove himself righteous before the Lord. He's actually agreeing with Bildad, and this is because his faith was so important in his life that he agreed with anything that came from his faith, no matter how much it hurt or how little comfort it gave. Our faith can give us comfort if we know it well enough, and as long as our comforters don't try to use it as a weapon against us when we're already down. In this case, Job agrees with Bildad and says that it's impossible for anyone who comes to God to come to God and plead on his own behalf. He goes on to say that God destroys the perfect and the wicked, which is true. He also says that God laughs at the trial of the innocent, that the earth is given into the hands of the wicked, that God covers the faces of the judges. He then compares himself with the very same innocent that are tried and says that God will not hold him innocent, even if he tries to cast off his heaviness and find comfort. He goes on to say that no matter what he does, it's not enough, which is also true. God is not a man, and there is nobody between God and Job to lay a hand upon both of them in judgment. He wishes that God would take away his rod and not let fear terrify him, and then he'd make his case. But it just isn't that way. He speaks some truth here in saying that nobody is clean before God, and there is no way to make ourselves worthy of pleading our cases with God. At the time there was no mediator between God and man, but praise and thanks be to God that there now is, the man Christ Jesus, the Son of God. God is high above us, and we have no right to judge him. Rather, he judges us. But Job, rather than saying that he's innocent of everything, is saying that he doesn't know what he's done to deserve all that he's suffering. All he's seeking is a little relief, and nobody and nothing, not even his friends, will let him have it. Job chapter 10. Job says it himself. He speaks in the bitterness of his soul, leaving his complaint of himself because his soul is weary of life. He pleads with God for a reason for what's happening to him. He asks God if it's good for him to despise the work of his hands, if it's good for him to oppress, if it's good for him to shine on the counsel of the wicked. He asks if God is like a man, and then asks why God inquires after his iniquity and searches after his sin. He reminds God that God knows all things and has personally made Job, like he personally makes each and every one of us from conception to our birth. He asks God to remember that he is made of dust, and asks if God will bring him to dust again. He talks about how badly he suffered, likening it to being curdled like cheese and being poured out like milk. He then goes into what is righteous. Whether he is righteous or sinful, he has nothing to boast about, and if he is sinful, he deserves what's upon him. He then talks about how God is punishing him like a fierce lion, renewing witness against him and increasing indignation on him. How horrible Job feels in his suffering. Next, we hear him ask why he didn't leave Job unborn. God always has plans for those he's created in the womb, but Job doesn't know why God didn't let him be unborn or let him die in the womb. He asks why God won't just let him have some rest for a little while before he dies. Notice how he mentions the land of the dead. Before I go whence I shall not return, even to the land of darkness and the shadow of death. A land of darkness is darkness itself, and of the shadow of death, without any order, and where the light is as darkness. Job is pleading with God to just let up for however long he has left so that his last memories of this life are peaceful and comforting. This is no longer just a man ready to die. This is a man pleading for a reprieve from his suffering, which we can all sympathize with. He's starting to come out of the deepest pit of his grief a little, now not pleading for death, but pleading for just a short time of comfort from his suffering before death. Job chapter 11. Now Zophar the Naamathite chimes in. He starts off by saying that his answer is for a multitude of words and a man full of talk, as if to say that he's tired of Job's talking, which is hurtful and insulting to a man's suffering. He even accuses Job of lying and mocking, and then accuses him of saying that he's pure and clean. He goes on to say that God exacts less than Job's iniquity desires. He goes on to talk about how God's ways are higher than our own, and we can't understand them, and no man can withstand him. He even says that God knows vain men and sees wickedness also, for vain men would be wise, though man would be born like a wild ass's colt. This is some way to comfort a friend in need, as in it's some wrong way to comfort a friend in need. Not only is it accusatory and insulting, but it's also conceited. Then he has the nerve to tell Job to put away iniquity and wickedness from himself as if he was being punished in the first place. He goes on to say that once he does that, he will have all sorts of comfort and prosperity, going back to that old prosperity gospel that's never done anybody but its preachers any good and has never done anything but evil to all its hearers. He even ends with a warning that the eyes of the wicked will fail, they will not escape, and their hope will be as the giving up of the ghost. How conceited and insulting can a friend be? We should all take note of how these men are responding to their friend and be sure to do the exact opposite of what they do. Job chapter 12. Job first opens with saying that he's not inferior to his friends in knowledge, and that they are the people in wisdom will die with them. He then says that he is like one mocked of his neighbor, in this case it's his friends, and he calls on God, and God answers him. The just and upright man is laughed to scorn. He says that the evil and sinful prosper by God's generosity, and those who are ready to slip are as a lamp despised in the thought of he who is at ease, or that those who are about to fall into suffering are despised by those who do not suffer. What sticks out here is that God brings into the hands of those who provoke God and are robbers, among others. Here he's saying that God causes the just and upright to fall into suffering and shame and provides for the sinful and evil, and it can seem that way to us in our time of suffering. But God is truly good to us all, and the time of suffering is short compared to what God has in store for us in the future. He then goes into all of these things that God does, which even animals and the earth itself can teach. He says that all things are ultimately done by the Lord. God is the soul of all living and the breath of all humankind. He says that with the ancient and long-lived is wisdom and understanding. He says that strength and counsel and understanding are of God. He then goes into all of the things that God breaks down and shuts, which cannot be rebuilt or opened back up. He brings all of the high and mighty, the powerful and the proud, the great and wise down, and leads them to become the very opposite of what they once were by the grace of God. He talks about all of the ways that God brings everyone who's in a high position down and destroys them, that they might be like everyone else. He comes very close to Paul's later statement that God resists the proud and gives grace to the humble, or that he chooses the weak and foolish things of the world to confound the strong and wise things of the world. Ultimately, everything happens according to God's plan, But Job's understanding of God, though it doesn't seem to have changed, has been more fully revealed. God doesn't just give and take away. God takes down everybody who is above anybody else in any station and leaves them unable to get back to where they once were. We should be thankful always that, as Christ put it, he makes the sun to shine on the just and unjust, and the rain to fall on the righteous and unrighteous. Job chapter 13. This time Job is furious. He starts off by saying that he knows all the things they're telling him, and he wishes that he could bring his case before God. Then he turns to accusing them of lying and being of no value to him in his suffering. He accuses them of speaking wickedly and deceitfully for God, accepting his person, contending with him, even mocking him with what they say. At the very least, he accuses them of coming close. He asks them if God should search them out, warns them that he will reprove them if they secretly accept persons, and says that God's excellency should make them fear and dread. Compared to God, they are like ashes and clay. He finally pleads that they would hold their peace and leave him alone to speak, and that whatever comes on him will come. He's tired of their threats and warnings and just wants to vent come what may. He feels like the worst has already come upon him, so what worse could happen? This time Job says that no matter what, he will trust in God, but he will maintain that he's innocent before God. He says that God will be his salvation because a hypocrite, one who says one thing and does another, or one who has a different standard for different people, will not come before him. He feels like he's ordered his case and will be justified before God. He asks who will plead with him, and asks that if he's silent, and adds that if he's silent, he'll die, as in he'll give up the ghost. He says that he must speak what he speaks because to not do so would feel like he was about to die. This is how so many feel when they need to vent and we don't let them. Job pleads with God to not withdraw his hand far from him and not let his dread not make him afraid. He tells God that if God calls, he'll answer, or he can call to God and wait for an answer. He asks why he's suffering like he is. He asks to be made known in his transgression and sin, and asks why God hides his face and holds him for God's enemy, and whether God will break a leaf driven to and fro or pursue the dry stubble. He says God writes bitter things against him and makes him to possess the iniquities of his youth. He says God puts his feet in the stocks, looks narrowly on all his paths, sets a print on the heels of his feet, and says that he, not God, but someone else, perhaps man in general, is as a rotten thing consuming as a garment that is moth-eaten. He feels like God may be dragging up the sins of his youth to punish him and scrutinize him, but he says that man is like a rotten thing that is eaten up quickly, or like stubble and dead leaves. Everything that God does, he is justified in doing. None of us are righteous. We're sinners, one and all. Still, sometimes what happens to us is not the result of our sins. Sometimes there are other factors at work that we know nothing about. Nonetheless, imagine how little comfort even a believer can gain from being told as much from the very beginning instead of waiting for the right time. Job chapter 14. Here Job makes a point that humans are born to live just a short time and their lives are full of trouble. The images of flowers and shadows are used to show our temporary state. He then asks if God opens his eyes on him and bring Job into judgment with him. He says that nobody can bring a clean thing out of an unclean thing. God has determined the days and months of man and set bounds that none of us can pass. Job then pleads with God to turn from him and let him have rest until he should accomplish as a hireling his day. He is making the case that because of the days of our lives being so short and full of struggle and suffering, God should let us have rest from our struggles and sufferings before we die. Here we see something that can be both concerning to us and potentially reassuring. Job remarks that humanity is not like a tree which buds when there is just the scent of water. Rather, humanity dies and wastes away, giving up the ghost. He asks, and where is he? He says, so man lieth down and riseth not, till the heavens be no more. They shall not awake nor be raised out of their sleep. But then Job asks that God would hide him in the grave and keep him secret until his wrath is past, that he would appoint Job a set time and remember him. He asks, if a man die, shall he live again? All the days of my appointed time will I wait till my change come. Notice that. Job is saying that he awaits his change from living to dead. He even goes on to say, "Thou shalt call, and I will answer thee. Thou wilt have a desire to the work of thine hands." Now we hear something different. It doesn't seem to be that he's talking about death. Rather, it sounds like he's talking about God raising him back to life during the resurrection of the dead. Otherwise, from where does Job answer God when he calls? And since when does God desire dead things, or call dead things the works of his hands? No, this is talking about resurrection from the dead. Now Job seems to go into the belief that all life is suffering. He says that God numbers his steps and watches over his sin. His transgressions are sealed up in a bag, and God sews up his iniquity. We see a little bit of science here when he says that the mountains falling come to naught, and the rock is removed out of his place, and the waters wash away the stones. He goes on to say that God washes away the things which grow out of the dust of the earth, and accuses God of destroying the hope of man. He prevails forever against him, and man passes. God changes his countenance and sends him away. A man's son comes to honor, and he doesn't get to know it. They're brought low, but those on the other side of eternity don't perceive it of them. Then he ends by saying that his flesh upon him shall have pain, and his soul within him shall mourn. This sounds a lot like the Buddhist belief that life is suffering, but it's not about desire. Rather, Job is talking about the effect that sin has had on the world and all those who dwell in it, and he asks for God to have mercy upon us all and give us all a reprieve before our death. This is going into how Job's experience with suffering has colored his view of the world and shows that he's going even deeper into suffering. At this point, it would be good to let him vent and maybe convince him that there will come a time when the sufferings won't be anymore. But let's see just how his friends answer him. Job chapter 15. Here's where Eliphaz the Temanite starts talking. He accuses Job of uttering vain knowledge and reasoning with unprofitable talk and speeches that can do no good. He accuses him of casting off fear and restraining prayer before God, saying that his mouth utters iniquity and chooses the tongue of the crafty. He claims that Job's own mouth condemns him for what he says. He asks if Job is older than them, or has older men siding with him than would side with his friends, both of which are forms of fallacy, appeal to authority and appeal to popularity, or bandwagoning in particular. He asks if the consolation of God is small with him, or if there is any secret thing with him. He asks why Job's heart carries him away, and what his eyes wink at, accusing him of sinning in what he says, saying that he turns against God and lets such words go out of his mouth. He then says that nobody is clean or righteous. He said God puts no trust in his saints, and the heavens are not clean in his sight. Much more abominable and filthy is man who drinks iniquity like water. The problem is that he thinks that Job is trying to boast that he's sinless and therefore unworthy of his suffering, while Eliphaz is claiming that he deserves suffering on the sole crime of being human. Neither of them understand that this isn't the judgment of God on Job at all. Job to his suffering, and Eliphaz as a weapon against Job to preserve a worldview that he holds more dear than his friend's suffering. Eliphaz's retort, which is what this is one in which he lays out his worldview. Everything evil that happens to someone is always because someone did something sinful, and thus they suffer only for their sins. No matter what they're suffering, it's always because they're sinful, just on account of being human. He doesn't take into consideration that there are other reasons behind suffering in the lives of people that don't relate at all to their sins. In all of these things he says about the wicked, he implies, or at least it would seem like that to Job, that he's talking about him. Job is getting browbeaten here as a man he used to consider his friend accuses Job of sin deserving of the suffering he's enduring. There are all kinds of sins and all kinds of ways that God has for people to pay the price for them if they choose to pay that price. And God holds back some and lets people have the consequences for others as he so chooses. Not all suffering is because of some sins, nor is it always from God himself. This is a major problem that a lot of people have with the problem of evil and God. Here's the thing. Not all suffering is the result of the fault of the sufferer, and we shouldn't treat them like it is. This doesn't make God unjust. It makes those responsible for the suffering unjust, unless it really is judgment from God. And when do we actually know enough about a person to say that's the way it actually is, like Eliphaz thinks he knows about Job? Well, this was actually a shorter video than I thought it would be. Thanks for sticking with me on it, and I hope you come back next time for Job chapters 16 through 31. Until then, God bless you all in every way in Jesus' name.